My name is Devin Griffiths. I'm an English professor and professor of comparative literature at USC. And this is an introduction to Barnaby Rudge, Dickens's novel from 1841, and its relationship to mob violence and the imagination of the mob in 19th century literature, and even, perhaps, how a novel like this can tell us something about human behavior and the human sciences. So this talk was originally developed for some Title I high school students at Fauché Elementary who are part of the Neighborhood Academic Initiative here near USC. They've had a long-standing collaboration with the Dickens universe, and so I came in and gave this talk, sort of introduced them to some of the themes of the novel, but also what it is that we do in college. So I start by talking about the liberal arts degree. So a liberal arts degree consists of an interdisciplinary study that pulls coursework together from the sciences, humanities, and social sciences and emphasizes connections between those different areas of knowledge. And what I emphasized was the US is actually a really special place to go to college because whereas in a lot of universities in, say, Europe, you specialize exclusively in one subject by the time you get to college. So that, for instance, if you were studying English, you take courses in English or the languages and history. Or if you're studying engineering, you would take courses in engineering, and math, and physics. In the United States, the core of higher education is the liberal arts degree, which emphasizes these interdisciplinary connections between different areas of study. And the idea is that you can draw connections, draw inferences from patterns that hold between different areas of knowledge. So I always tell a story about before I was at USC, I was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania. I had a student there who was a Chinese national. She was from Beijing. And I asked her, why are you studying here? Why did you come all the way around the world to get your college degree? And she said, in China, we have this idea that the United States somehow knows how to teach creativity and innovation. And I've thought about that a lot since. And I think part of the thing that they're talking about is this liberal arts degree. It's this ability and the encouragement to draw connections between different things. So when I was studying as an undergrad, I actually got a degree in English, but I also got a degree in molecular biology. And that all sort of funneled into the work on my first book, The Age of Analogy, which studies how it is that people like poets, people like social theorists, and especially novelists influenced the science of Charles Darwin. Not just how he communicated his theories, but how he understood the natural world, how he learned to describe it. So to me, that kind of study is sort of at the core of what a liberal arts degree is supposed to achieve. But in order also to sort of get closer to talking about the novel, I want to set the stage for where this novel fits in to the 19th century imagination of revolution. So in the United Kingdom, there's a riot or mass collective action roughly every 10 years in the decades preceding the writing of Barnaby Rudge. 1780, 1791, 93, 1816, 1819, 1830, 1831. It seemed like there were these periodic burgeoning revolutions in England that fundamentally challenged the sense that there was a stable social order. But the thing I want to emphasize is behind all of these social actions, there's anxiety about the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror in 1789. The French Revolution was the most important political event for 200 years to Europeans. It was actually far more important than the American Revolution because what it showed was you could have a mass popular uprising and it could totally overturn the established order and could even lead to the execution of the monarchy. And the important thing to remember also is that 1789 wasn't a finite year. The revolution kicked off decades of turmoil and unrest in France. No government basically could stand from 1789 on for decades. They'd have a revolution and a popular government followed by the restoration of monarchy, followed by a turn towards a dictatorship and empire, followed by a return towards democratic government. So there's a series of overturning mini revolutions happening in France. So behind every riot in England from 1789 on, people are asking the question, is this it? Is this the big one? Is this the thing that leads to a massive collective action, a wide popular uprising that will totally overturn the social order, destroy the current structure of government, and perhaps even lead to the death of our monarchy? So that's really, I think, what you have to understand is being behind a novel like Barnaby Rudge and the fascination with the mob that Dickens shows really throughout his career. But I should also emphasize this isn't just Dickens. This is a concern for most 19th century novelists. Um, so we're going to talk a little bit about how Barnaby Rudge is an historical novel. But before that, I want to say it's also an example of what we call a social problem novel. And the thing I want you to remember about the social problem novel is that it raises a question about a central problem that is being diagnosed in society, and then potentially it offers a solution. So as you're reading Barnaby Rudge, I want you to keep thinking about what is the problem that's being diagnosed? What are the sources of that problem as far as they're depicted in this novel? And is there a solution here? Is there a proposal for how these things can be resolved? But I also want to point out, these are some of the major novelists of the 19th century. All of these novels here centrally feature a riot, and one person appears in here twice. You have Dickens with Barnaby Rudge in 1841, but he comes back to this question in A Tale of Two Cities in 1859. And for those of you who don't know Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities is his French Revolutionary novel. And I think what that suggests is, even in Barnaby Rudge, in the back of his mind, what he's really worrying about is the French Revolution. He's worrying about what riots might precipitate in terms of a radical reconstitution of society and sort of mass destruction. Revolutions were not generally considered, just to be clear, a good thing by Victorians. Okay, so I think riots presented three crises for novelists, and particularly for Dickens. On the one hand, they represented a suspension of the law. Civil law disappeared. The police no longer had power. Sometimes you had the institution of effective martial law. You have the reading of the Riot Act. But what that suggests is the protections that exist around you as a citizen in civil society have dissolved. Two, there's a collapse of both class and gender distinctions. So on the one hand, whereas 19th century society relied on a really strong distinction between different places within a larger social order, particularly the relationship between the aristocracy at one end, the bourgeoisie in the middle, and the poor and the dispossessed at the other end of society, in the middle of a riot, that all gets overturned. Suddenly, all of the customs and traditions and rules that govern the relationship between these classes melt away. But they were also anxious about the collapse of gender distinctions. And you see this a little bit in Barnaby Rudge, I think, with Miggs and some of the relations that happen. But you see this especially in his later novel, A Tale of Two Cities, which focuses on these tricoteuses, these women who were involved in the revolution. There's kind of a terror of what happens when you have women in the streets involved in mass collective action, because it upsets everything they think they know about the difference between men and women. And finally, and perhaps most importantly for Barnaby Rudge, there's a sense that riots precipitate a loss of individuality and identity. The question becomes, what is it that motivates a mob? How does it understand what it's doing? How do you take control of it when people dissolve into it? When in some sense, everything that makes them distinct and individual disappears when they are part of its mass action. And this is a problem that you'll see Dickens returning to again and again in Barnaby Rudge. Anytime there's a group of people together, the question becomes, what is the nature of control? Can it be exerted? And will this dissolve into chaos? All right, so now we're going to turn to Barnaby Rudge. And before we actually read a scene from Barnaby Rudge, I want to just point out its importance as an historical novel. In other words, a novel written about a period in the past. When Dickens titles Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80, the '80 he's talking about, obviously, is the Gordon Riots of 1780. And it's important to realize if he's writing in 1741 and he's thinking of 1780, there's about a 60-year gap. And that 60-year time period is absolutely at the core of how the historical novel works. Historical novelists, from Walter Scott forward, had understood two things about the time you need for historical novels to work well. On the one hand, you need to have moved far enough away from that moment in the past to have perspective on what happened, right? You need to be able to see in a way that you could have not seen in the moment, what are the causes, what are the problems, how does it work? But on the other hand, if it is only 60 years in the past, there are still people living today who have experienced it. You can still go out and talk to people who were part of that world. So there's enough continuity with that previous moment, but also enough distance to get perspective. So when Dickens titles his novel Barnaby Rudge, A Tale of the Riots of '80, what he's basically doing is flipping on a neon billboard sign that says, "This is my great historical novel." And it's an interesting moment in his career where he really imagines himself as the heir to Walter Scott, probably the most popular and successful novelist of the 19th century, who focused and sort of invented the historical novel. Dickens ends up taking a different track with his career, and partly because Rudge was not the success he anticipated. But it's important to remember, for Dickens, this is a serious attempt to write his first serious historical novel, and he announces it from the very beginning. Okay, now we're going to skip forward to pretty late in the novel, to page 363 in the Penguin edition, to look at what's happening in one of these riot scenes. And I'm going to use this to illustrate what we call close reading. Now, close reading is a technique that we use in English literary scholarship to pull apart the language and the techniques that happen within a passage to understand what it is that's going on. The way I like to think of this, it's a bit like you're disassembling a clock. You're pulling apart all of the gears and the springs. You're figuring out how they work, and then you're seeing how all of that stuff fits together to produce the movement, the effect of this passage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this passage out loud once, and then we're going to kind of go back through it and talk a little bit about how these different languages work, what these different effects and figures do for this passage, and the way it considers the relationship between the mob and the individual. But the throng of people, the foremost of whom had heard every word that Lord George Gordon said, and among all of whom the rumor had been rapidly dispersed that the stranger was a papist who was bearding him for his advocacy of the popular cause, came pouring out pell-mell. And, forcing the nobleman, his secretary, and Sir John Chester on before them, so that they appeared to be at their head, crowded to the top of the stairs, where Mr. Haredale waited until the boat was ready, and there stood still, leaving him on a little clear space by himself. They were not silent, however, though inactive. At first, some indistinct mutterings arose among them, which were followed by a hiss or two, and these swelled by degrees into a perfect storm. And then one voice said, "Down with the Papists!" And there was a pretty general cheer, but nothing more. After a lull of a few moments, one man cried out, "Stone him!" and another, "Duck him!" in other words, dump him in the water, and another, in a stentorian voice, "No popery!" This favorite cry the rest re-echoed, and the mob, which might have been 200 strong, joined in a general shout. Now I'm going to go back through this passage, and I've highlighted a few words so that we can focus on them in our close reading. That is not what I meant to do. How does that work? There. First thing I want to call your attention to is the language of the mob. We have the throng in the first paragraph, we have the mob in the second paragraph, and another word that they would use in the 19th century is the crowd. These are terms just focusing us on the fact that what we're talking about is collections of people in important ways. I also want to focus in green on the language of anti-Catholicism. You have the word papist, which is sort of a mild slur for a Catholic at the time. You have popery, which is another word for Catholicism. And the point I want to make here is this is about sort of religious bigotry in the 19th century and about the way in which people were prejudiced against the practice of other religions, in particular how Anglicans, or a little more widely considering the question, how Protestants looked at Catholics at the end of the 18th century. And this sort of anti-Catholic sentiment is something that was still alive, if attenuated, by Dickens' time. But the passages that I really want to focus on are the ones I have in blue, because they say a lot about how Dickens' language explains or interrogates or explores the nature of mobs. We'll begin with the phrase, "rumor had been rapidly dispersed." And the thing I want to point out about it is, it's an example of passive construction, okay? And in a passive construction, the doer, the agent, the subject of the verb has been removed, and the object has taken the position of the subject. Rumors don't disperse themselves, obviously. The people were circulating the rumor. But the people are absent, and the rumor that they were circulating has been the subject through the construction of this sort of past tense reflexive verb. Rumor had been rapidly dispersed. And there's also the sense of speed, right? Of fluidity, of rapid effect here. as if the mob is sort of sutured together in some way. We see this extended through the phrase that follows. The throng came pouring out, as if they are some sort of liquid, as if they are some sort of undifferentiated substance, something that you cannot actually divide into discrete units, something whose behavior is defined by its collective action, and moreover, something that you do not think of as having agency. It seems to be responding simply to the physics around it, the pull of forces. But I also want to call attention to the way that Lord George Gordon, his secretary, and Sir John Chester, in being pushed, appeared to be at their head. In other words, at the head of the throng of people. The important thing about this is that on the one hand, it's emphasizing this possibility of there being a head. And as we know, the head is the seat of reason and decision. If they were the head, this would reconfigure this social scene as a sort of organic model in which there's a body, there's a brain in control of it, there's somebody in charge, and everything else is sort of knitted together into the wider frame. But by saying they only appeared to be at their head, the passage is reinforcing the sense in which any attempt to believe that there's some portion of this crowd that's in charge is illusory, that there could be no head of a crowd, that they aren't defined by the kind of things that heads do in terms of making decisions. We move on to the following paragraph. We get again these sort of passive constructions, but also a movement towards a language of degree rather than distinction. So we get indistinct mutterings arose among them, which were followed by a hiss or two, and these swelled by degrees into a storm. Indistinct obviously reinforces this sense that there's no one speaker, no one person muttering, that the muttering is so general and shared that no individual mouth seems to be voicing it. But also the mutterings arose among them, another example of a passive voice that evacuates a sense of active agents, of individuals, and convinces us that these things are sort of moving on their own in some sort of collective action. There's this uncertainty about what they were followed by. They're followed by a hiss or two, and these things swelled by degrees. Things that can be increased by degrees are sort of undifferentiable in terms of substance. They weren't swelled by discrete numbers, right? And when we get to a perfect storm, we again return to the sort of liquid metaphor that Dickens was working with in that first paragraph. Storms are made up of water, of rain, of clouds, of things that are by definition kind of nebulous. And moreover, they are things that we do not think of as having an agent, a singular agent, something in control. We see this carried through the rest of the passage. It's re-echoed, etc. But you can see how throughout the passage, Dickens is working hard at the level of his language to convince us that a crowd doesn't work like a person does, and that once you have a crowd, you do not have distinct individuals anymore. But I also want to call attention to the way that this passage fronts a conflict between a crowd on the one hand and an individual on the other hand, represented by Mr. Haredale. If Gordon and his secretary and Chester are unable to sort of differentiate themselves from the crowd, or at least hold themselves as exempt from or distinct from its agency, it seems like Mr. Haredale is able to do that, right? They give him a little clear space by himself. And this is just one of these tiny little moments, I think, that get figured in all these different ways in this novel, where you have somebody standing on their own, figuring out a way of engaging with the collective and figuring out a way of holding them off, asserting authority. And it seems as if Dickens is searching for a way to understand how can one respond to a crowd? How is it possible to restore control, authority, discretion, and the individuality that these things require? Okay, so in wrapping, I just want to return to this larger question. When we read literature like this in this intensive way, how can it illustrate questions in other fields of discovery? How can it illustrate questions of psychology or science? And it turns out, for instance, there's an entire field now of psychology that studies just this question. It's called crowd psychology. And I actually just pulled these categories from the Wikipedia entry on it. But what's so striking is the categories that they speak about here are very much alive in this passage. One, we have one of the main theories in crowd psychology is de-individuation theory. This idea that the crowd is created through a loss of individuality. And we've been tracking that through the metaphorics of that last passage. But 2, 3, and 4 are theories that emphasize a sense of collective identity. There's convergence theory, this idea that when people come together, they figure out what they agree upon. And that last passage in both paragraphs emphasizes what this crowd at least explicitly understands itself to be agreeing on is its anti-Catholic sentiment, its attack on popery. Another version of this is emergent norm theory, this idea that they come to agree on a shared value, a shared sense of what's right and wrong. And again, the shared norm there seems to be that Catholicism is wrong. And there's also the theory of social identity, which is that once you get a group of people together, whatever the largest shared category of identity that they have is, that determines their behavior. And again, in that previous passage, it seems to be indicating what they decide that they share is their status as either Anglicans or Protestants. In other words, their status as non-Catholics. I'm going to skip flocking behavior, but I just want to point out that this question is very much alive today. This was an article that was in the New York Times just 2 days ago. It read, they thought it was a shooting. The real danger was a mass panic. A stampede of global citizen concerts in New York on Saturday raised questions about the city's ability to safely handle panic in a crowd. So it seems to be, if Dickens in 1841 is worrying about how is it that we can understand crowds and responsibly create structures, regulations, and systems of control to prevent the damage that they create, that is not something that we have figured out in any substantial way. And I want to end by talking about this book, Proust Was a Neuroscientist. This is another example of a kind of interdisciplinary study that thinks about the relationship between literature and psychology. It's written by a writer, Jonathan Lehrer, who worked in a neuroscience lab. And his main argument is Proust, who's writing in the early 20th century, worked out certain features of the mind, certain insights into how the brain, and particularly memory, works, that neuroscience is just figuring out today with all of its ability to do MRIs and active CAT scans. So I want to close by just saying, at the end of the day, a novel like Barnaby Rudge, even though it was written 170 years ago, still has something to teach us, I think, in its intense way of trying to figure out what is the relationship between the individual and the group, what sort of questions do these collections raise, and what are their implications for how society will move forward. Well, thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoy reading Barnaby Rudge. It's one of my absolute favorite Dickens novels. I think it's amazing and crazy and gorgeous, and it's worth taking time to think about what it's worrying about. Thank you.